Good morning to everyone here for whom it is morning. Good afternoon to whomever it is afternoon. And good evening to whomever it is evening. And good night to whomever it is night. But I'm going to call this morning coffee with me because I'm going to be enjoying my morning coffee here in a little bit. Welcome to the stream. I've been contemplating a topic for a while. And that means since about midday yesterday. Maybe a little bit after that. I took some breaks to work and sleep, but this topic has been kind of bothering me, to say the very least. And the topic of delusion and denial actually very closely related to the topic of education and knowledge. And why do I say that? I say that because if you know what's going on, there is at least some basis for you to make an educated decision about how to do something in your life. But if you don't know what's going on, well, you're pretty hosed. And I made the mistake, or perhaps this is a blessing in disguise, of taking a look and seeing what many people's preconceptions were in the realm of politics. What that means is that a dear friend of mine was suggesting that I might like to take a look into the Finnish Classical Liberal Party. It's supposedly the closest thing that we have in Finland to classical liberalism. And the party is currently in its infancy. The basic to my understanding, there's a core of people that actually kind of know what they're talking about, and an outer ring of people that really have no clue. And I've been trying to figure out for a while, unsuccessfully, whether or not the people on the outside are deliberately clueless, whether they're trolling, whether they have ulterior motives of some other kind. There are all sorts of different explanations for their behavior. Now, perhaps I may understand classical liberalism differently or wrongly than most people do, or differently than most people do or wrongly, but there are some things that just don't add up. In other words, I can understand, for example, the Lockean life, liberty, and property as human rights. And then you can wind up having people that say, oh, that sounds so wonderful. And then they go around and essentially, in order to fit their preconceptions, they wind up effectively redefining the terms, or just choosing to circumvent them entirely. Going and paying lip service to them, and then having, their actual opinions being far from the point that they claim to believe. Well, that for me was very tricky. For me, that's very tricky. because... What in the world is wrong here? Yeah, that seems very tricky to me. Because if you're going to claim to know something, and actually make these claims in public and try to discuss things intelligently, I would assume, maybe I'm wrong here, that you would research the subject beforehand. That you would not just have an opinion, but have an educated opinion, especially if you're going to be talking something like politics. The difficulty is, okay, if everyone has a particular preconception, if everyone has a particular idea of reality, whether that idea of reality is actually based in reality is immaterial, because they're going to engage in groupthink. And that makes it more difficult to inject reality. For example, let's say that I believe in the right of my neighbor to life, liberty, and property. What does that imply that I could hope that the government would do for my neighbor, if anything? I'll leave you to think about that for a while I go and pour my coffee. Well, if I believe in my neighbor's rights, I would suggest that the only role the government should be allowed to take would be in protecting and acting in accordance with those rights that I have, that my neighbor has, and that everyone else has. That's assuming the existence of these rights. Where these rights come from is, at least in terms of presupposing them, completely immaterial. If you claim to believe that people have a certain set of rights, and then you go and say you have the right to life, but you have the right to liberty, but you have the right to property, but, well, then all of a sudden those rights become meaningless. The rights become completely meaningless when you do that. Now, let's say I wanted to kill my neighbor. Well, that would be me using my liberty to violate someone else's right to life. Now, I understand that life, liberty, and property are generally understood in that order for a reason, and that life supersedes liberty, supersedes property. Obviously, if you are not alive, you cannot be free. And if you are not alive and you are not free, you cannot actually own anything. Because even if you have a master that says, okay, you can own something, that master would be able to take it away at any point. See, that's life comes first, then liberty, then property. And it never goes the other way around. In other words, life, it means having a shot at the future. Liberty means having a shot at the present and the future. And property means essentially being able to keep that which you have done in the past or the fruits thereof in order to, quite likely, according to your own plans, help you in the present and in the future. So if we look at these as principles and operate therein, and then suggest that the government should be able to violate someone's right to liberty because of my personal preference, all of a sudden we have elevated my personal preference to the same status as someone else's liberty. This preconception that this is how things work, this preconception that I should be able to recruit Big Daddy Government and his thugs to force my opinion upon somebody else, is where I have the problem. And it seems that due to the fact that it has occurred this way for so long, due to the fact that it has occurred this way for so long, it has, and people have grown up in it, it has become such a foreign idea that the government doesn't have, assuming human rights are an actual thing, and chief among them are life, liberty, and property, then government shouldn't have a right to infringe upon them, but should instead preserve and protect them. So, due to the fact that long-standing tradition would dictate otherwise, people, I guess, find it difficult to function within a different paradigm, even one that is dead easy to make logical deductions within. Dead easy. It's like, when we evaluate, should I do this? The first question, am I violating somebody else's life, liberty, or property? Well, if not, then it shouldn't be forbidden by law. If not, then it shouldn't be forbidden by law. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it always necessarily works that way. Because people seem to be quite willing to make exceptions to the rule. I said, go be a fundamentalist Christian, but don't teach your kids to stone gays, and don't go stoning gays yourself, right? Go and be a fundamentalist Muslim, but don't condone or participate in terrorism, right? And of course these are very, very broad things, but just use that same level of common sense in terms of deciding whether or not the freedom of others is worth impinging upon. If someone wants to be a Zoroastrian eunuch, well, let him be a Zoroastrian eunuch, assuming he consents to the unification. I don't even know what the process is. Snip, snip, snip. The snippy snip process. It's his body, and though I may disagree and say I would never do that to myself, how dare he do that to his own body? Well, it is his body. And though I wouldn't say that children are property, I would say that they are autonomous entities, the stewardship of which are entrusted to the parents until such a time as they are capable of making good decisions. If the issue of homeschooling comes up, people can say, oh, well, people shouldn't be allowed to homeschool their own children because you couldn't guarantee that this child will get the same education as that one, as that one, as that one. Is unequal. Well, I don't see any of those particular rights that we were discussing. It wasn't equality, and especially not equality of outcome. It wasn't equality of educational environment either, because I know I will do a better job of creating an educational environment for my children than anyone else in the world will be able to, aside from my wife, who, guess what? We're working together. So, these basic little things turn up from time to time and demonstrate the incredible logical inconsistency that people are willing to put up with. So, I don't know whether that's delusion, whether that's denial, or what it is. I don't know. I really don't know. Oh, I would love to be able to chalk it up to ignorance. Or that somehow some existing within a particular paradigm feels right, and so people do that. That's something that one can deal with. So if someone just feels like something and that feeling happens to be wrong, well, you can just go and teach them how to feel something else. For instance, feelings are very easy to change and are subject to all sorts of... Where is that stupid mosquito? Anyhow, on another note, I think that... Ha! Got it, I think. Yeah, wouldn't it be great if we got rid of all mosquitoes? Then you wouldn't have to worry about transmission of malaria. And, yeah, that disease would go bye-bye. So, it seems to me that most people, when they do think about politics, I suppose don't even think about the policies per se as they fit into any given claimed paradigm or value system. In other words, they have their own default value system, which has gone largely unchecked and is largely incapable of being is largely indefensible. Not that the value system itself would be indefensible by somebody who's actually competent to defend it, but that people will appropriate it unto themselves without having done their due diligence and thought about something. For example, right after September 11th, 2001, people asked me my opinion on Islam. And the only thing I was able to say at that point was, well, I don't think that anyone of any religion should be allowed to commit terrorism. I think anyone should be allowed to commit terrorism. And when it comes to the actual religion, I'm not going to say anything until I've read the Quran. Well, after reading the Quran, I came to the conclusion that if somebody actually does believe what the Quran says, without some other framework for interpretation, for instance, then they would be forced into condoning said acts. So, as such, is Islam should it be treated as a religion, or should it be treated as an ideology that incites murder? Similarly to, for instance, the Old Testament passages about stoning homosexuals. Okay, so if somebody reads the Bible from cover to cover, will they come out of it with the understanding that they should stone homosexuals or not? Well, that you're required to have some sort of a framework for interpretation, and that framework for interpretation might vary from group to group. Personally, I know that Lutherans, which is what most of Finland is at least nominally full of, believe that there are certain kinds of laws in the Bible. There are ceremonial laws. There are laws that were written specifically for the administration of the Israelites prior to the coming of Jesus, and then there are moral laws. And then, of course, we Christians would not be subject to the ceremonial or the administrative subsets of the laws found in the Old Testament, of which the stoning of homosexuals would be a part of. So, a historical understanding of the passages would mean that our armchair theologians that think that somehow that's what fundamentalist Christians want, or force people to not adopt the moniker fundamentalist for whatever reason, on account of the fact that they have this weird idea of what fundamentalist Christians really are, is just kind of strange. But there are already laws against stoning people. There are already laws against committing terrorism. There are already laws against all sorts of initiation of violence against somebody else. And so I don't think you need to go and create thought crimes on top of other things, which is essentially what many people advocate for. No, I don't think that people should be allowed to say this. I don't think that people should be allowed to teach that. I don't think that people should be allowed to associate with other people under certain terms, and so on. Well, if someone has those particular kinds of views, that's I would suggest that they shouldn't be calling themselves classically liberal then. Just pay lip service to the subject and then move on. Pay lip service and then do what I want anyway. I mean, that's not much of a smart thing. Anyhow, with that note, I need to get the plunger for the French press. Here we go. So the thing that bothers me, and this is something that has bothered me my whole life, is that people that claim to have knowledge of something, or claim to espouse certain principles, or claim all these different things, and then have their life not matching up with their claim. That makes it much more difficult to interact with people, because it means that you can't necessarily take someone for their word. You can't take someone for their word. And from someone who grew up in a context where your word meant something, you say, I believe this to be true. At least you would expect them to be able to function within a paradigm that they claim to be able to understand, especially when it's asininely simple. And again, I don't know how much of this could conceivably be occurring due to Dunning-Kruger or many other such phenomena. And while we're on the topic of delusion and denial, I think that I may have deluded myself a lot as to what the nature of reality is. I think that I've deluded myself because I expect certain things out of certain people that oftentimes consistently don't come true. So who's stupid, really? There are reasons that the manipulative ones that know how to appeal to emotion and all these other things that say and do all the right things, even though their words are backed up by fluff, wind up rising to the top, whereas these people that actually have substance are very hard to come by in the field of politics. And it's specifically because people have found that feeding others a pack of lies works. Feeding others a pack of lies works. Contributing to the delusion of others, insofar as that delusion is structured around, ticking off their Maslow's hierarchy of needs or what have you. People are hugely heuristic in nature and hugely pragmatic. So, if you can bypass the critical factor and talk to their, quote, lizard brain, end quote, you get big results. I mean, there are books, there are all sorts of books about it, not the least of which is Propaganda by Bernays. I believe that was Freud's son-in-law or nephew or something along those lines. Anyhow, he's very intimately involved in psychology when it was initially or in its early stages formalized as a field. And there's also Gustave Le Bon's crowds. Okay, and these things, propaganda and crowds, have been around for a very long time. It's not necessarily 100% scientifically based, but there is a lot in these works that explain how people behave in response to all sorts of things. And basically, these works say that people need to be people need to be masters of propaganda if they actually want to get anywhere. Which it kind of makes sense. For all of history, who has held the power? The power has been held in terms of, or by people that can come up with systems for everything, right? There's the liturgy in church. You go to church, you go through the same motions, and whether they are of value or not, we don't necessarily need to discuss, but we do discuss that you have everybody standing, sitting, kneeling at the same time, and that generates a sense of camaraderie amongst everyone who is standing, sitting, and kneeling. And if you go to a church with the same liturgy, you are automatically going to feel that same camaraderie with everybody, because all of you know, okay, here's the part of church where this happens, then after this comes that, and so on. And with very little variance over the course of the past 2,000 years, a liturgical tradition has been preserved. So that, of course, gives the church power over the lives of everybody that goes and, participates in this, and who picks up the implicit assumptions, whether or not they're stated every day. Now, the church is kind of losing its role as the the cornerstone of society, the cornerstone of Western society. And due to the fact that human beings are so hierarchical in nature, they crave to have some sort of a strong leader. Most human beings crave to have some sort of a strong leader, or at least someone that they can trust, or something that they can trust. And one of the other points of delusion and denial is that people say, okay, well, we are now modern man. We don't need gods. As such, maybe people think, oh, I don't need an idol. I don't need to worship some block of metal or wood or stone or something. Or I don't need to worship an Abrahamic god, whether it be some deity in the sky or someone who came down from heaven or what have you. I don't need to worship all these things. These are widely held opinions. Now, of course, there are still many people that do worship Abrahamic gods in this world. There are Jews, there are Muslims, and there are Christians. But the secular is becoming more and more powerful. But interestingly, the secular people would like to think they do not have a religion. And in the sense that there is no overt deity, then maybe secular people don't have a religion. But in the sense that there isn't something in which people trust and put their trust in a matter of having faith, belief is that's hogwash. People have all sorts of beliefs. The thing is, we wouldn't necessarily call them beliefs because that sounds too antiquated, right? We call them axioms. If we have axioms, they're either implicit beliefs or things that if we ask the appropriate questions and finally go deep enough, we're like, okay, this is now something I'm going to hold as true. Well, if you hold certain aspects of things as true that many people in the world now hold as true, you wind up actually deifying government. Deifying government is what people do nowadays. people get reactionary when they say you're deifying government, because kinds of things deny human nature. They deny where we came from. They deny what constitutes us. They deny the hierarchical nature of our consciousness, or our consciousnesses, and the way we relate to each other and the world around us, and so on. And due to this, uh, more enlightened people that don't want to deify government could quickly go and become nihilists. Right? That's why nihilism is on the rise. It's because some people that understand this sort of a thing can say, well, okay, I don't want to deify government. Well, what is there left to deify? Well, I don't know. Okay, well, what's there to impart meaning to life? I don't know. Well, I guess I need to make meaning then. I would need to make meaning if I don't have these moral structures to guide me. If I don't say, okay, I believe in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, or I am merely a small cog in a great machine that should be controlled by the government. All of those are statements of belief, and all of those serve to structure our lives. And thinking that any one of them is less a religion than another is foolish. Very, very foolish. Because it's denying human nature. So what are some other delusions and denials? I can go and talk more about them, but I would be interested. I would be very interested in hearing what you guys have to say on the matter. I'd be interested in hearing delusions and denials that you've perhaps seen other people committing, or things that are in your own life. I've deluded myself into thinking that people can be counted on to be rational. It just bothers me because I find it very difficult to respect myself if I start delving into the irrational and the emotional. If I use that as a basis for communicating with other people, I hold my own competence in contempt. Like, do I really need to stoop so low? And I guess the answer is maybe. Maybe I do. But how can I continue to do that and still have my own respect and the respect of the people that actually matter to me? And I still haven't figured out how to do the mental gymnastics required for that. I mean, I can obviously try to make what I say sound as nice as possible. I can, show people that I care, because I really do. But in the end, I don't know. I guess I'm just as delusional as anybody else. Anyhow, there are other elements of delusion and denial. For instance, you can deny that hot coffee is hot for as long as you like, but as soon as it does touch your mouth, you will realize how hot it is. There's a lot of interesting possibilities to explore here. There are a lot of interesting possibilities to explore. Yeah. Made that a little too strong. I could have used about 2/3 of the coffee that I actually put in. Oops. Well, I suppose if that's the case, I can just do that. Cool, great. Cooled it down and got the strength to be right too. So I would be interested in thinking, what is it? What are some delusions and denials that certain beliefs, certain things that lots of us hold that get in the way of us having the lives that we want to have? What are some of them? Because I know there are some that are quite common to mankind, and then there are others that are a variance thereof, but that are quite specific to the individual. They're quite specific to the individual. Mine mostly revolve around how people make decisions and having unreasonable expectations of others. Having unreasonable expectations that other people would be making their decisions logically instead of on an emotional basis. And I would say that an awful lot of that could conceivably come from a place of emotional insecurity or instability. Lots of people, I don't know if they actually know how to be free. I don't know if many people have learned freedom. I really don't know if people have learned freedom. How to function, how to make decisions, how to be an autonomous human being. I don't think many people actually know how to do that. It's easier to outsource your thinking. It's easier to do as you're told. It doesn't require as much energy expenditure if someone else is doing your thinking for you. And if you find that sort of a thing difficult or strenuous, it just means that you're not willing to pay the price that it takes to be free, to make good decisions. But apparently freedom is still alluring or enticing enough that people don't want to go and say, hey, by the way, I've given up my freedom for comfort. People know, they inherently know this is a stupid thing to do. Or maybe it's okay for me to give up some of my freedom for comfort. If I can find an employer for whom I can work, I can give up some of my freedom on a voluntary basis, on a consensual basis, to work for this employer and get a wage in return for the time spent and the value that I provide. I should be able to cancel that contract at any time, as should my employer, but that would be one example of giving up my freedom. But at least I understand the terms of doing that. One of the biggest difficulties I have is that, for instance, with the school system, is that parents go and, in many aspects, force their kids to give up their autonomy without being able to consent to it, under the assumption that this is just a part of living in society. Under the assumption that this is a part of living in society. And that, well, I suppose technically it is a part of living in society if society's structured around it, but that doesn't necessarily make it right. It just means that it's effective for those who are in charge to do it. It's effective for those who are in charge to facilitate the process of sending one's children to state-sponsored babysitting, due to the fact that you could conceivably, or at least one would think that you could raise GDP per capita by having two parents working instead of one, for example. And it's interesting because you don't count, let's say if someone's a homemaker, someone stays at home, either a mom or a dad. The work that person does is counted toward GDP, directly, anyhow. It may influence it to some extent, but it wouldn't actually be counted toward GDP. But if you pay someone to look after your kiddo, it does get counted toward GDP, even though the same exact work would be done no matter what. Or at least under the best of circumstances, the same work or even better work would be done under whatever case we pick. So, due to wanting to be able to have higher GDP per capita figures, or due to the fact that it's easier to homogenize and streamline a population, public education is almost ubiquitously in the Western world a thing. A thing that I cannot wait to have it be defunded, disband, just go away to the dustbin of history. Anyhow, with that said, there are other topics not relating to education. I think education is one of the most important ones. That's why I keep on bringing it up. And I think it's interesting that the story of the Emperor's New Clothes is told time and time again to younger generations, and that the lesson seems to be learned by the little ones and forgotten as they get older. But then again, why would one expect any different? Now for another look at delusion and denial. Socialism. Communism is a utopia predicated upon the idea that human beings would be able to work as hard as possible. Work, and produce value, produce value, produce value, produce value, produce value. And then be able to go to a store and get what they need and no more. From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. And if you are a true communist, you believe that the role of the state is to not exist. There is no state as such in communism. Now, the reason this doesn't work is because human nature will not do something for nothing. Knowing that I can work so hard and I can accomplish so much, I can make something, and then have somebody who pretends to work hard. Yes, the had a little connection issue. The communism doesn't incentivize production of anything because, well, there are a couple of reasons. One, it's not human nature to be separated from the product of your own labor. It's not human nature to make something and then say, well, this actually isn't mine. This belongs to everybody. And then be able to go and to take only what you want. Well, okay, if everyone take only what you need, everyone will show up and work as little as possible and take as much as there is to be taken. Which means, as the joke goes, people will pretend to work, and consequently they'll pretend to get paid. They'll pretend to be paid. Anyhow, socialism works because there is the element of state compulsion. I mean, it works in a sense, and that is the only way that one could have a hope of accomplishing the same kind of redistributive tactics that communism would entail. And the whole idea behind socialism, everywhere that it's actually been implemented, people have tried to change human nature. They thought, oh well, human beings are so malleable. We can go and change these different things. We can go and set up circumstances whereby people will work for nothing and then take as little as what they need, which is, having one's work and one's compensation not being commensurate with each other. Well, so breaking the cause and effect of I work, I get the product of my labor. You wind up getting the cause and effect of I work or I get my butt kicked in and am potentially shot. Right? So communism and socialism, I mean, but socialism is less delusional, right? But communism is built upon this delusion that human nature is different than what it is. And socialism is built on the delusion of communism. That somehow all we need to do is force people to do this for long enough and they will internalize it and think that it's a good thing. You know, if Marx is to be believed, we have what, another 350 years or so before communism will be a thing? I don't think so. I really don't think so. And then on top of everything, how will people know what to produce? How will people know what to produce? If I'm only producing what I want to produce, and everyone is only producing what they want to produce, and nobody's actually producing what they want to have, well, then there winds up being shortages of all sorts of things that people need, and excesses of all sorts of things that people don't. What can fix that? Well, price points can fix that. You know, people will pay for what they value, and so the price will serve as a signal to other people as to what it is that would make sense to have made. You know, if nobody is farming, if everyone decides I would rather be doing something than even, you know, pushing a button on a remote control combine or what have you, pretty soon the price of food is going to go up to reflect the lower supply, or the lower quantity supplied. Or rather, to reflect the unsatisfied demand, because everyone needs to eat. Well, in communism, where people would just be doing what they want, why would people give up doing what they want in order to make food? Why should I give up doing what I want to make food if I want food, but I know that if I start making food and I'm the only one that starts making food, then the majority of the food that I make is going to be taken away to give to the people that didn't give up what they wanted and start making food instead. That's why this whole from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, it's another reason it breaks down, is because you don't have price signaling to demonstrate what it is that should be made. Ah, hi Ole, hi Jacob. Good to see ya. Lovely, there are 4 people watching now. So, communism and therefore socialism, they are built on delusions. And it's interesting, I was having a conversation with Ale about the nature of capitalism. And being the INTP, the good INTP that he is, he's always trying to model and maximize different parameters. And I'm giving him a hard time about this because there are some things that are so complex that we can't model them completely and appropriately right now. I would say human nature is one of them, although we can certainly model how to manipulate somebody in a certain way. I mean, there's all sorts of machine learning that has been implemented into things like Facebook advertising and whatnot. But So if I recall correctly, Ale, you were basically saying that, yeah, capitalism is good, but there has to be something better. There has to be a way of even further optimizing things. And ultimately, the question is, okay, how do we deal with a bunch of information that is difficult to weigh and to quantify, and so on? Well, the answer that capitalism gives, well, the answer that socialism gives, let's first start. Communism and socialism don't give an answer. The answer is, oops, you done screwed up, you starve. Okay, period. Well, that doesn't work. That really doesn't work. I mean, or B, you do what I say, and oops, I guess I screwed up. You starve. Or I don't want you to starve, so I shoot you. Or burn you alive, or throw you into pits, or whatever. The answer capitalism has is price signaling. It's very simple and elegant solution. Because the price someone is willing to pay reflects the value that a particular good or service has to the individual paying. You know, if I'm willing to pay you $200 an hour to do something for me, and someone else is willing to pay you $100 an hour to do something for them, ceteris paribus, you would have an incentive to work for me because I value what you're doing more than the other person, and you will receive more in exchange for doing your work. And since your time is a scarce resource, you can use the money as one metric of how to allocate your time. And if you don't feel like working for me for $200, I would say that you shouldn't be forced to do it. Right? Many people have altruistic motives of doing all sorts of things and do things for charity for free. And that's due to other pressures, of course. That's due to other desires. Or if you're closer to the person who would be willing to pay you half of what I do, well, you might choose to do that. But still, I would have that $200 then to go and pay somebody else to do whatever it is I value, or maybe someone else would be willing to do it for $199 or $150. But the whole point is that, and then we could also go and look at Say's law, is that our productivity, whatever it is that we wind up producing, gives us purchasing power commensurate thereto. And so all right. So let's say that I produce. I own a small soft drink company, and I produce, I don't know, say 10 million bottles of pop a year. And on each of these bottles, I make a profit of say 20 cents. So I'm pulling in 2 million a year. Well, I'm pulling in 10 million a year. Let's say let's say I sell them for $1 a piece, and 20 cents of that is profit. Well, 80 cents of that is going to make more. 80 cents of that is going to make the product. It's going and putting into the economy for all the people that supply me with bottles and caps and the coloring chemicals, the sugars, the sweeteners, all these other different things. And then the 20 cents is what I get for putting all the stuff together and turning it into something more valuable than what the original products were. In other words, adding value, adding my own labor, adding my service to whatever already existed. Well, that leaves me then with the extra value that I gave, the extra 20 cents per bottle, the extra 2 million, I can then use that however I want. But if I would have only made 1 million instead of 10 million bottles, my purchasing power would have only been 200,000 as opposed to 2 million. reason I bring all this up is because value is subjective. Value is very subjective, and unless I am doing what either I want, in which case I don't pay myself, I just make what I want, and then that's it, or I'm doing what someone else wants and engaging in free exchange with them on mutually agreeable terms, unless all that is taking place, it's very difficult to determine what should be done. Well, should I produce an extra next year? Should I produce, instead of 10 million, should I produce 11 million bottles of pop? Well, I could think, well, what would the utility be to people? How would it be? I add that all up in my head. Or I could look and see, okay, will people be willing to pay me for another bottle of pop? If people are willing to pay me a price I'm willing to accept, then yeah, I'll make the extra million bottles of pop. And if people aren't willing to pay me, well, then I guess I won't make the extra million bottles of pop. Would I consider the current system capitalism? Could there be such a thing as the capitalist ideal? Sounds pretty similar to the communist utopia. Okay, I'm reading all that you're saying there, Ollie. Well, you could, I suppose, go and go down that particular bunny trail wherein you say that everything is capitalism, because there's always a marketplace for ideas. But then some ideas are always going to have more force behind them than others, specifically because they will have more force behind them. If goons with guns can go show up at your doorstep and take you to jail for refusing to submit to a certain idea, well, I would say that that idea then has force. So it's not really a free market. The difficulty is, and this is with any system, is as we were discussing earlier, people crave a hierarchy. People crave structure. People crave, for lack of better terminology, an object to worship. Whether we like it or not, that's how we're built. And whether we call it worship or not, it's what we do. And no, capitalism is not equivalent to communism in that people crave submission. No, the current system is not capitalism, because it's predicated upon, well, it's not the ideal of capitalism, because it's predicated upon the idea that, for instance, people that already have made it can go and turn conservative, which basically means protectionist. And by protectionist, I mean protecting my own ideals. So let's say I've started a company, and then I can go and lobby the government to allow me or my cronies or people that are associated with me to regulate me and anyone else who goes into the field. Well, why does that work? Well, because the government has the power to do that. And in complying with the regulations, in dealing with the regulatory requirements, that erects a false and very high barrier to entry and takes away the free competition. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that the government had the ability to do that in the first place. People could get paid off to do that in the first place, as opposed to if the government was small enough that could not actually occur. And the problem with that is the same exact problem that there is with communism, is people want something for nothing. People will always have an incentive to go and try to go and become members of government because they can go and sit around with their thumb stuck up their rear end rather than actually providing value for somebody. They can sit around with their thumb stuck up their rear end and wait for everybody that wants to have a favor from them. And if they have amassed enough power unto themselves to grant these favors, all they ever need to do is be little favor granters to the people that will pay. So in other words, if I've generated value at one point in my life to one person, that means that I am all of a sudden now capable of buying somebody off and continuing that forever. I would say that is wrong. But the problem doesn't lie with the actual capitalist. It lies with the government that's of course I would say the doing is wrong, but the way to stop it is not to somehow throw laws in place that say you can't do that, because you can't count on government to police itself. It's just by having the government be so small and by having ordinary citizens be able to keep it at bay to prevent these egregious things from ever happening. And that's why from time to time, governments get big and bloated, and then they collapse and so on. And I'm going to say that these kinds of cycles, people going and making things good and making things really, really good, and then people getting complacent and stupid and lazy and horrible and make things bad, and then people get stronger and better and more innovative and build character. And life is cyclical. The world is cyclical. That's inevitable. That's just a part of life. But I would say that at least for our part in it, we can have a particular character. We can conduct ourselves a particular way, regardless of how anybody else does it, and we can attempt to structure society around us such that we continue the general upward progress of society in terms of GDP per capita increases and productivity growth, essentially, which has been approximately 1.5 to 2% per year. For all of human history, on average. But then don't inject these other things that are predicated upon the idea that human beings are different than what they are. That is what I have a problem with. It is any system that is in place predicated upon the idea that human beings are different than what they are, or that doesn't take into account human nature. If human nature is not taken into account appropriately, the system will not work. Capitalism takes into account human nature, and however imperfectly it may be, I don't think that you will find anything that is in principle better. You can probably find variants that work better than others. Ways of improving market efficiency, for example, with ease of information transfer. Faster financial transactions, faster getting news from the source to the viewer, but then ultimately, then you end up having choice of who decides what people see, and all these other questions. But I think that the paradigm, the framework of capitalism has been shown to be congruent enough with human nature to generate value and drag the entire world out of, or drag a great percentage of the world, and will continue to drag the world out of poverty. Of course, there will always be some poor people, but going from well over 90% abject poverty to increasing the world's population and now having close to 10% abject poverty in the span of 2 centuries is unheard of. in terms of any other, I I don't know if I would even call capitalism an ideology, system of behaviors just existing. No other idea has ever done that to humanity. They're at least predicated on ideas, specifically current in economic theory and philosophies, the manifestation of abstract ideas between human beings in a symbiotic relationship. What's begging the question? Yes, we have tried another system. Yes, we have. Holy crap, we've tried another system. Read your world history, Ale. Read your world history. Yeah, that's the idealness of the system will depend on which parameters you want to maximize. There are a bunch of people who are, for example, Green Party members that want to decrease GDP per capita because they value the environment more than they value humanity. And they can go and come up with all these other explanations as to, okay, well, I value the environment and I think that humanity won't be around if we don't take care of the environment. Well, that would be a good reason. Then there are other kinds of people that are like, well, I value the environment so very much. I like, say, cougars or something. I like mountain lions. And I value mountain lions more than I value humans. And then there are some people that are actually self-loathing, that are like, well, I think that we as human beings are terrible and deserve to die. And so I'm going to act in accordance with that principle and try to ruin humanity. Like, there are all sorts of perspectives. And if we look at the drive that we have as human beings, it is to have offspring. Right? Ultimately, what wins? What wins is who passes on their genes and who passes on their ideas. Like, people could go and do whatever they want, but humanity in general will be perpetuated along the lines of who passes on their genes and who passes on their ideas. And if an idea isn't good enough to cause you to pass on your genes and ideas to the next generation, well then, oops, I guess it got selected against. That's the basis for tradition. I'm not saying that tradition is the end-all and the be-all, but I am saying that the place of tradition is to keep a record of what has worked for people in the past. And conservatism as such basically says, okay, this is a good starting point. If we try to reinvent the wheel and something happens, we can always default back to this and be pretty well assured a certain outcome. But if we don't know our history and we don't know what's going on and we actually haven't kept track of what people have done over the course of history, well then we can't be expected to have any better understanding of what's going on. You know, that's what education is for. Education is for the purpose of teaching people to make good decisions. And we can easily be in delusion and denial due to just... We can be in denial of reality due to lack of knowledge of exactly what constitutes reality. Of course there's invariance. If you argue that one could devise a system to decide which parameters are best to maximize, then either you get infinite regress or have to start with some subjective principles. Well, start with the principle of freedom. Just let people do what they want. If they die, they die. If they live, they live. And if you want to help out somebody who's dying, then help out someone who's dying. Or something of that nature. I mean, that would be pretty easy. And here's the thing, right? If you want to try something else out, under my framework of not violating the life, liberty, and property of other people, if you can go and amass around yourself enough people that want to try your idea, then just go and try it. Go do it. Don't sit around here circle jerking about it. Go do it. I mean, if you don't have the balls to go and actually try something out, but just want to sit around as an armchair philosopher, well, don't expect me to take the idea any more seriously than I would an armchair philosophy. The invariance in human nature, we don't agree exactly what it is. Anarchy could conceivably work. The difficulty with that is that some power structure will emerge, and it's likely that if it's brought by anarchists, most anarchists are not particularly educated. So, I mean, some of them are. Some of them are very, very wise. So that means that whatever would come out of it would likely be predicated upon many of the fallacies that have plagued humanity in the past. Of course, maybe the only lesson we can learn from history is that nobody learns any lessons from history. Yeah, anarchy is unstable. Power structures of some kind or another show up. Well, even in small groups, people look to have minimal, but certainly existing hierarchies. So, yeah, I really fail to see where okay, so classical liberalism essentially necessitates an educated populace. So the way to take power in such a situation is to dumb people down. Well, lots of, I mean, that's the way to take power in a lot of circumstances, is to dump other people down. What's necessary for communism to work is for human nature to be different. So one thing you basically do have control over, the education of a populace, or at least it's something that can be modulated to some extent. Human nature can't. So you look at what needs to change in order to make a system work. You look at the current state of affairs and then you act in accordance with it. Don't make the problem more difficult than it actually is. Well, all of human history has been selecting from the marketplace of ideas. It just so happens that some idiots decide to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. It seems like we are biologically predisposed in avoiding certain problems to cause for ourselves others. And there's nothing we can do about it. So, but the most that I've been able to find that we can do about it is to have an educated populace that has a an easily implementable, culturally perpetuated, consistent moral structure that can adapt to change. I don't know, have either of you read Caleb Beer's book, Hubris? If you haven't, buy the thing and read it. Just buy the thing and read it. I mean, I did. And yeah, it sounds very much like something Caleb Beers would say. But especially his last chapter, I could have written the thing myself. I mean, I would have written it a little differently, but the content, I could have written it myself. Ah. It's like if you're talking about a nice place to start, and you know, I'm actually contemplating, even though I'm not the dude who wrote the book, and I definitely don't want to go and somehow spoil the book or take away from Caleb's ability to sell the book. But I think that it would be nice to have that be a starting point for some discussions that we have. Specifically because it's short enough to get through, dense enough to actually have something to say, and thought-provoking enough for, I think, all of us to, at bare minimum, get something to talk about. You know, heck, I think that would actually be fun. Would you guys be down to start a monthly book club? If I went and I put together a website, and then we went and figured out, okay, what books would we like to buy, and see if it'd be possible to get bulk discounts and things of that nature, and then just all of us just pay a certain amount per month, buy the books, and read them and use them as context for discussion. Would that be something that you think that people would be interested in doing, or do you think that that would just is that an overdone, overused idea? Well, I'll wait for you guys to respond, and then whenever you do get your responses, I will use that as a couple data points to see if it's something that would be worth doing, and if it is, if we can somehow get better deals on books or something, that would be nice. If we can't, then it would still be nice to use books as some sort of a starting point. I was actually having a I appreciate free ebooks as well. I would say that some information is actually worth paying for. I actually have spent a great deal of money in amassing for myself real books, like physical books and ebooks. And it has to do with the idea that, number one, if you're willing to pay something for it, that means you actually value it. And two, well, it means you value it, so obviously you're going to take it more seriously. And two, the person that actually wrote it, if the person's still alive, for instance, to get something from it. I mean, I don't know how much of, for instance, Nassim Nicholas Taleb's, how much of the money actually goes to him. But I have made him, at least in proportion to how many of his books I bought. I bought all of the things that he's written and read them. I've made him richer in proportion to, well, actually, I would say that I got a much better deal than he did, because I wound up spending a much less on the books than the ideas were worth to me. Like, I think this idea of need to wait until you're a little more settled in life. You always liked having the idea of a personal library, but that will need to wait until you're a little more settled in life. Well, you can have a Kindle library. You can have a Kindle library. And I don't know, I guess I've just had this idea that, yeah, it makes sense to not want to pay for something. It makes sense to not want to pay for something. Obviously, to some extent, free is very good, but to another extent, free is worthless. Free is worthless. How many free books have you read that haven't done a single thing for you? How many free things? It's what's the word I'm looking for? There are things like success porn and productivity porn and so on. Okay. It's you read about success, you don't put any effort in, you get your dopamine shot, and you move on with your life. Get maybe a little bit of serotonin too. You read about productivity, and somehow your neural circuitry deludes itself into thinking that you're being productive, even though you're not. All you're doing is reading about productivity. It's another one of those delusion and denial things, and this is a very, very difficult one to swallow, especially if you're feeling like you're doing all these different things, but really all you're doing is sitting around performing mental masturbation. I know that's a hard thing, especially for intelligent people to hear. And very, very difficult for intelligent people to hear, because people like to think, well, I'm using my brain to its maximum capacity. I know I'm not using my brain to its maximum capacity, but I know that I come much closer when I actually have a goal in mind, and I'm willing to utilize whatever resources I have at my disposal to go for that goal, whether it be money or time or goodwill of other people. If other people, would like to go along with whatever idea it is that I'm saying, then that's kind of nice. Um, but I can't say that I've valued many things that I've gotten for free. And so that's why I highly recommend that we be the kinds of people that focus on producing things of value and using the fruits of our labor to invest in both ourselves and the people around us, the circumstances that we find ourselves in, etc., to produce even more value and ultimately build ourselves up organically in that sense. That we take whatever path that we need to in order to get to where we want to be in life. There are all sorts of hard lessons that I've had to learn. There are all sorts of hard lessons I've had to learn. So with that said, I am going to put the intermission screen up here in a bit and have a potty break. Ah, did you know it really helps to have your keyboard plugged in? I was wondering what in the world was wrong with it here a while back. If you actually plug in your keyboard, did you know it tends to work a lot better? We'll do our usual thing where we have, say, an 8-minute intermission. And I'll look forward then to seeing you guys on the other side. And if you have any questions or comments, I would really like to be able to have as much of a dialogue as possible. I would love to hear your comments. I would love to have your questions. Feel free to take a dump on me if that's what you think I need. And feel free to tell me if you think that I'm wrong. Because I do say a lot of things that are, well, not exactly the most palatable. Alright, well, see you on the other side. Right, well. Crap. Can you hear me? Okay, there. At least I see something indicating that my audio is working. Oh, yeah, what got me banned in the first place? Apparently, somebody reported me for insincere content. Yeah, yeah, I was banned for insincere content. Like, at least to the best of my knowledge, I haven't been insincere. I haven't been lying. I haven't been. I mean, you could say I was wrong. Clearly, you do disagree with me on, say, the point of whether or not immoral people should be able to get rich and so on. But by and large, I would say that disagreement on a point like that wouldn't constitute grounds for banning. But I think that somebody just got a little bit, I don't know, perturbed by something I said. But yeah, I wound up actually having to submit my petition twice. Yeah, I don't report people for disagreements. I don't know, people may have thought that my response to the piece, so it had something to do with hating men. And Yulva and I, we tore that piece apart and we laughed at it because, well, it was ridiculous. It was completely full of misandry and impossible to take seriously, except for the fact that people did take it seriously. It was interesting that we wind up getting into conversations, for example, about whether or not it's okay for women to behave badly toward men or men to behave badly toward women. Well, why don't we just say, what are the terms by which human beings should interact? And are there conditions, where men and women behave differently toward one another due to the biological differences? Well, those are good questions, but I wouldn't say that one should be looking for reasons to justify bad behavior. Yeah, I figured that it would have been your. I figured it would have been your blog. From YouTube's, from Google's platform. It was like a blogspot blog or something of that nature. Okay. Yeah. I haven't had any blogs banned, though I did have a. I'm trying to think. What kind of account did I have banned? Yeah, I was banned from streaming on YouTube, and then there was one account that I posted some political stuff on that was apparently not necessarily to the tastes of whoever was administering the thing. So yeah, delusion and denial. There are a lot of And this is one of those taboo topics that's difficult because it forces me to introspect. And generally, I prefer to do introspection by myself. Generally, I prefer to come to my own conclusions about my own shortcomings and not really do it in the presence of other people. It's just difficult, not because I don't want to own up to my shortcomings, but because um, uh, having been the subject of, or being the object toward which many other people's vitriol has been directed, it's difficult to open up. It's just way safer to, not show my face, not show my words, not show much of anything. So coming and doing this whole blogging thing or vlogging thing or YouTube thing or writing answers on Quora thing just for the purpose of having a repository of information to share with people is quite difficult in and of itself. And then when it comes to bearing more about my own self, that's even more more difficult because it involves saying things that have at some point in the past been used against me. So with that said, I suppose I can talk a bit about delusion and denial in my own life. I, for a great deal of my early, we'll say mid to late childhood and early teen years, was very much in denial about human nature, or rather, I understood it in theory, but I had such good examples. I had such good role models in my life that I expected people to behave well. And then I came up with every single conceivable excuse under the sun for people that weren't behaving well. So, oh, okay, well, this person's probably just young. She'll outgrow this. Or this person, he just is. He just doesn't know what the situation is. So let's give him some helpful information or what have you. And slowly but surely, as I went through college and I went through many hurtful instances, I realized that that I was in denial about human nature. Like I had gone and read all about, okay, these ideas resulted in these things during history. And then I came to my conclusions on the matter, but I didn't actually know why. I just kind of knew, okay, well, people don't function well under certain frameworks. Like, people don't function well under socialism unless basically, people won't do something unless you point a gun at them. Well, why? Because when I was little, I was raised in a household where participation in the daily household activities, doing your chores was a thing. Doing your chores was a thing, so I thought, well, okay, well, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Well, maybe other people don't function well in that paradigm, but at least it seems to me that quite well describes family life, and lo and behold, it does. But then I thought, well, okay, well, why not in a bigger thing? Well, ultimately, it has to do with the relationship that people have to each other, and the fact that there was a power structure in place, albeit a very soft one. A very soft power structure in place. I mean, my parents were loving and caring and so on, but clearly, they were the parents, I was the children. The household had rules, and we obeyed them. Period. Um, and then I got to thinking, well, okay, here on one hand we have household rules, and here on the other hand we have things that work in the state. And then I got to thinking, well, how do we maximize utility while maximizing freedom? Is that really a thing? Is that really a thing? Because at first I thought, well, maybe it's just that lots of people won't, do their chores. Or that people won't naturally within a household or something establish a division of labor. No, people will do that. You have husband and wife moving in, people shacking up or whatever, and somehow the dishes get done. Somehow the floors get swept. Somehow the laundry gets done. Somehow the windows get washed. Somehow the dusting, sweeping, toilet cleaning, and all these other different things get done around the house. Well, this works because of the relationship that people have. But given the fact that in one's close circle of friends, one can only have a handful of people. There's only a handful of people that this sort of a dynamic actually will work with at any given time. And then the further removed, the further you go out in the concentric circles away from self, the less of an incentive you have to behave in a certain way. And the distance between these concentric circles obviously depends an awful lot on the society, but once you get far enough from the individual, there are other principles at play that predominantly dictate people's behavior. And another thing that I've noticed is that going back to that original thing of, okay, well, what is one's deity? Okay, is the government a deity? Is it an Abrahamic god? Is a block of wood? Is money? What is one's deity? And even further, what is one's value system? Like, is there a value system associated with a deity? Is there a value system somewhat distinct from, but with loose associations to a deity? How does this all fit together? And then ultimately you discover, well, people's value systems really do determine how they act. And the stronger the family is, the less strong the government needs to be in order to maintain the same amount of order and discipline. For all this thing about parents not being allowed to discipline their children as kind of a societal rule, the reason that's a thing is because the state can discipline. Right? Somebody holds the proverbial sword. Somebody can punish the wrongdoer. Somebody always has that prerogative. Whether it be the circumstances of life coming and biting someone in the butt, which is, I think, one of the best teachers. It is the best teacher because it's completely organic, and you wind up seeing how action and consequence are inextricably linked, and to what extent certain actions have certain ramifications, and so on. Then you also have the the element of, okay, well, I just violated somebody's rights, or, oh, I just did something that could conceivably get me killed. Well, I would say it's the parents' responsibility to prevent against these things that can get a kiddo killed. And I would also say that it's the parents' responsibility to engender some sort of a moral system such that one can function within society without having even worse things happening. If I learn how to be respectful at home, then even if I do run into the worst kind of people, if I know how to keep my cool and behave respectfully regardless of how I feel, you can get yourself out of a lot of bad situations. If you know how to behave in the context of, say, manners at dinner table, you can go and have dinner with heads of state and conduct yourself better than they do um, at times. If you know how all these things work and you learn them at home, the societal structure can be incredibly loose and free. People will be able to, having internalized a particular set of behaviors that allows them to associate well with others, freely go about their business. Whereas, if all of these things are not inculcated at home, then you wind up having the state going and fabricating all these different things. And because it is a less personal entity, and because it is of the nature it is actually much more homogenous than it would be each family teaching their own, even if it is the same set of values. Because the manifestation of the values in a system where everyone needs to be the same under the state means that the values will be hammered into everybody the exact same way. And so what a little bit of authority in the home accomplishes necessitates, upon removing it, a considerably greater authority in the state. So and that has to do once again with the proximity, these concentric circles of, close friends, acquaintances, people that you see around and have no idea who they are, etc. People that you don't see uh, and whatnot. The it has to do with proximity. Uh, a little bit of force applied close to home is way more powerful than a lot of force applied from far away. And doesn't necessarily engender resentment. So anyhow, I grew up with these ideas about how life was supposed to be. Having read in history why these things work and don't work, or at least come to my own conclusions about why things do work and don't work. But it was very theoretic. It was very theoretical. It took me living in the world. It took me, and I know university life is hardly a proxy for real life, but I happen to be the guy that many people came to with their problems. I don't know, it was interesting. I was the 13-year-old older brother figure to many people who were in their late teens and early 20s. And so I was, through other people and through my own decisions, because I wound up doing things outside of school, exposed to real life. And I then came to the conclusions that, yeah, the conclusions that I had come to earlier were, for the most part, correct. I needed to change some assumptions and so on. But, in looking at it, I realized, yeah, people aren't what I would like them to be. And not everybody understands this, or at least not everybody can articulate and act according to this very compelling explanation of concentric circles of influence, circles of friendship, circles of interpersonal interaction. And so people get these grandiose ideas that communism is good. We all to some extent have blind spots, and we all to some extent lay on a bed of ignorance. And there's something we all can do about it. But it's an awful lot more effort than most people have ever put into things. And the nature of school is such that it would have us never focus on these things. It would have us learn by rote a whole bunch of things that are in the state-sponsored curriculum, and that's it. Critical thinking, reflection on reality, and the nature of all these different things are not something that anybody or something that very few people get out of school being able to do due to the nature of the school that they wound up going to. This is the thing that life teaches, and this is why school, insofar as it divorces action from consequence, does anyone in school a disservice, because it perpetuates an illusion which allows people to be delusional, and then when they see reality they can be in denial. Well, see you, LA, good night. Timestamp of this is now something like 1 hour 59 minutes and 52 seconds, or whatever it may be. So yeah, if you want to continue watching after you're done sleeping, it'll be up here. Good night, Ale. So yeah, going and doing this whole experiencing real life thing, and keeping enough of an open mind to realize that human nature could conceivably be way worse than I ever gave it credit for, or way better. And in certain aspects, humanity gives me a great deal of hope, and then in other aspects, humanity gives me a great deal of terror. There's a far broader spectrum of human experience than what can be accurately conveyed in the pages of history. I mean, it can be barely. Good literature barely scratches the surface. Real living is the only way to get an awful lot of that. So, what I would suggest, in order to prevent delusion and denial, and obviously I need to do more of myself, because you can always apply yourself more to life than what you're applying yourself. I can always apply myself more to life than what I'm applying myself. Is maintain the open mind in terms of discovering and learning new things. But then once you go and you observe enough of what's going on in the world, just realize that if the shoe fits, wear it. If the shoe fits, wear it. Because ultimately, because of the nature of life, what we do is what ultimately matters. So that means that we need to have skin in the game. If we have a thought or something, the best way of doing it isn't necessarily running a simulation; it's actually going through with it. And if we go through our real life experience, having discovered that fire burns in some way, shape, or form, will at least, if we didn't venture too far out, if we didn't do things that were irrevocable in the sense that we're dead, we grow. Of course, there are bits of wisdom from the ages that can be learned, so that people can learn by foresight rather than by bitter experience. But then there are a lot of things that aren't necessarily explicitly written down or easily accessible, and so we should just approach life with the attitude of, okay, I'm going to learn this now. And that's really nice. That's incredibly nice. And that helps us both eliminate delusion and denial, and ultimately improve our decision-making ability. The only way you ultimately get better at making decisions is by making decisions. It's not by facing analysis paralysis, going and analyzing everything to the nth possible degree and then not coming to a conclusion. Because the only way you're going to know whether your conclusion actually works, or whether your conclusion is actually valid, is if you go and make a decision based upon it and see how it either succeeds or fails. All the modeling in the world can be very, very useful if you put it to use. But if all it does is remain a model, then it's just that, a model. And that's often why there's a disconnect in between academia and people who have more practical, who've made more practical career choices, let's say, is that academics can afford to stay within the realm of a theory. They can afford to remain within the ivory tower, which I really like that realm. But at the same time, I fear being there for too long. I love going there from time to time and sharpening my wits and challenging other people and just being there and let's engage the intellect, and I drink that in. I love that stimulus. But I don't want to leave it at that point, because if I leave it at that point, I know there is a chance that I leave a horribly bad legacy. So I would much rather leave the legacy of having actually done something, and that means that consequently I am far more of a failure than I am a success, as is every single successful person in the face of history. The thing that lots of successful people, or at least I've discovered by observing them, is they go and they nip the failures in the bud while they're still small. They go and they observe the trajectory that a certain course of action takes, and if the trajectory is going to wind up taking them to a bad place, they stop and then decide, okay, let's rethink this, let's restart this, let's try something new. And then they go and they try something new and they fail again, but they fail a little less the next time. Until finally you go through all these iterations of whatever the process happens to be, and then you're on your way. And then, if you want to make it even better, you systematize whatever it is that you've done. You document it, you write it down so that it will be replicable by other people. And then you go and you start solving the next thing. You start working on the next thing. You start exploring the next thing. You start putting all the pieces together. And then figuring out the next thing in the same way that you did the first thing. And then pretty soon you wind up amassing for yourself meta skills. Meta skills that cannot be amassed by theorizing alone. So, that is basically at least what I've figured out in terms of being able to deal with delusion and denial. The meta skills I am working on cultivating within myself, perhaps planting, or perhaps I'm just working on breaking the hard soil. But we'll say planting and cultivating within myself have to do with going through this path, I was much more patient with other people toward the beginning. I was much more patient. And throughout the course of my late teenage years, my patience waned. My patience just, it waned and then it tanked. So, along with gaining some little bit of wisdom here and there, my patience for those that haven't gone through the process of so doing went down. Namely because I was doing whatever I was doing at whatever age I was doing, and then I was finding people decades older than me that hadn't gone through the same kinds of things. I mean, I guess that's kind of just a normal part of life if you wind up going to university at the age of 11 and whatnot, and graduating with 2 degrees when you're 16. You wind up doing things a little bit early, and perhaps perhaps my paradigm is different than the paradigm of other people, to some extent, or at least the expectations that I had of myself with regard to learning. Yeah, when I was in university, especially in the early years, I had good conversations with people. We were able to challenge each other, bang ideas off of each other, and I would say arrive at something that would be at minimum more true than what we started out with. And I've, in general, found myself to be less patient to do that kind of a thing now that I have more demands on my time. So I kind of go and expect people to go and figure things out for themselves, and to go through the particular stage of their life wherein they do think about cause and effect, and wherein they do enough exploration in order to gain some semblance of an understanding of how the world works. But it seems to me that many people aren't interested in doing that because they're perfectly content with the way things are, which works rather nicely as long as the status quo doesn't get disrupted. But as soon as the status quo gets disrupted, it forces learning. The difference is, and this is the lesson that I've learned throughout history, is people don't respond until there's pain. People don't respond until there's pain. People don't respond until there's pain. Which means there can be all these wonderful ideas that don't reach their time yet. And the reason they haven't reached their time yet is because people don't experience the pain point that causes them to go and accept the idea. They can go and say, well, this looks in theory like a good thing, but I'm going to continue doing things the way I've always done them, and encourage other people to do the same. Going back to the subject of public education, that is especially due to teachers' unions, probably more due to teachers' unions than anything else. It's going away. Or at least it's becoming less and less relevant to real life. And in having public education becoming less and less relevant to real life, people are going to wind up finding substitutes. People always do, because people always need to learn. People always need to learn. And because people always need to learn, they're going to do whatever it takes. The thing that scares me is that public school will be in no way sufficient. It might barely suffice at best to cover the needs of people. who intend to enter into society, say, and be productive. If your goal is to enter society when you're 18, living in limbo land until then. School will barely be enough. I mean, it's not enough now. The rate of absolutely poorly educated people who are barely literate, if that, people who can't think their way out of a wet paper bag, people who can't do logic, people who can't do all these, who can't balance a checkbook, people who can't make wise personal finance decisions, people who don't have any modicum of self-control, people who do all these different things that are quite counterproductive to leading a good, prosperous life, at least insofar as I understand it, are exiting school. Getting your diploma, getting your GED, dropping out, whatever it is. School isn't fulfilling all the needs that wind up being fulfilled at some other point in life by some other source, or just never getting fulfilled at all, thus leaving people susceptible to having a worse life. So I can go and I can talk about this until I turn blue in the face, but until people recognize that, and until the pain becomes so great that they're actually willing to move their butts and do something about it, my words are meaningless, in the sense that people won't listen to them. Now, my hope is that in having made all these videos, in having answered all these things on Quora, in having done blog posts, in having had these conversations, I'm hoping to plant seeds. I am planting seeds right now. And then when things do happen, as I say they will, I can go and say, hey, look at the timestamp on this, look at the date stamp on this. I called this way back then. Now look, are you ready to listen now? And then, because I've been the one opening my mouth and putting a whole bunch of YouTube videos on things that people don't necessarily care about right now, but will care about in the future when they become relevant to them, I'm playing a very long-term game. And hoping that people will wake up before digging themselves into too deep of a hole. So, with that said, we have about 15 minutes left of our stream. Where is this? There we go. Where are we? I'm trying to find a particular Darwin Award. Booby Traps Trap Boob. 2002 Darwin Award winner confirmed true by Darwin. November 2002, Belgium. A retired engineer booby-trapped his home with the intention of killing his estranged family, but died himself after inadvertently triggering one of his own devices. At first, police assumed that the 79-year-old had committed suicide as he was found alone with a bullet wound in his neck. Then a detective missed a bullet by inches when he opened a booby-trapped wooden chest. Police beat a hasty retreat from the property and called in military experts. They deciphered an enigmatic series of scribbled clues to locate 19 death traps in walls, ceilings, and household objects. A pile of booby-trapped dinner plates was revealed by the clue "cheaper by the dozen," a reference to a film in which a child throws a plate at someone's head. Police speculate that the notes were intended to assist his failing memory. Other traps included numerous concealed shotguns triggered by threads, and an exploding crate of beer set to detonate once a certain number of bottles were removed. It took 3 weeks to crack 19 of the 20 clues, and experts were forced to admit defeat on the final note. "The 12 apostles are ready to work on the pebbles," said one. "We have never come across anything like it before. It was all fiendishly clever." True to form, the fiendishly clever but careless Darwin Award winner was described by neighbors as a taciturn but harmless man who enjoyed puttering in his garage, but relatives say he never forgave his wife for divorcing him 20 years before. Police believe he began installing the traps for 4 years after losing a lengthy battle to keep his home. So, revenge. I guess the INTP says revenge is a dish best served cold. Doesn't make too much sense to me. I mean, revenge does always make sense to me, but it just seems to me that in seeking revenge, one could be, at the same time, spending more time on things that could conceivably be much more productive. So, don't take revenge. Oh, thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Jacob. It's very kind of you to say. Very kind of you to say indeed. That's very kind. That's something that constantly does surprise me, is the very kind response I've gotten from opening up and sharing. You know, some people treat you horribly, and other people are well, kind of like this. You know, being able to sit down and have a conversation from 3 places all over the world over, at least for me, over a cup of coffee. I don't know what you guys were doing, but being able to have you and Ale and whoever else might have been watching, being able to interact on such positive terms, of course. Doing things in person is also quite nice. Although, being as introverted as I am, I would say, not necessary all the time. But, yeah. It's, certainly a big blessing, because we wouldn't have been able to do this even a decade ago with anywhere near the ease that we're doing it now. So it's a great privilege just to be able to do it, and then also to be able to do it surrounded by you guys. Doing it surrounded by you guys is something it's in one sense the fulfillment of some things I've wanted to do for a long time, but didn't ever see how it could conceivably manifest itself. Because providing value for other people is something that I've always felt very strongly about. And then when I know that at least somebody has found a little value in what I've been able to put together, which, at least to me, sometimes seems like incoherent ramblings. It's quite humbling. I suppose this needs to be emptied anyway. And my coffee was still a bit too strong. So I'll take the last couple mouthfuls from my son's sippy cup, and then I can go and wash it and get him some new water for today. Much better. I'm not used to making coffee too strong. This is actually really good stuff. I believe it was Arvid Nordquist brand. This is Festivita. It's, extra dark. Highly recommended, just don't use too much. I would say about... So there are these spoons here. I would say use about 1 3/4 spoons of coffee, along with 3.5 cups of water. Now, this is actually enough for 4 coffee cups, but I only fill it up to about this point here. I think that, I was accidentally using the amount of coffee that I would have used for the slightly less strong one, but if ever any of you want to come over for coffee, it'd be kind of nice. It'd be very nice. And if you don't drink coffee, well, I suppose there's always tea. And if you don't drink tea, well, there's water and milk. And if you don't drink those, well, I don't know. Good. Good. Not a complete substitution for interpersonal interaction, but it really is it is a blessing. And I have to say that being able to especially to interact with Caleb, especially interacting with Caleb Beers, has been incredibly important to me. And knowing that there are other caring people. Yeah. It would be nice. And I'm thinking that if I had a budget, a good enough budget, I would put together a get together of whoever wanted to come. I'd be like, okay, first, say, dozen people that, or let's see, say first 8 to 10 people that would like to do it. Just sponsor plane tickets and say, okay, we're going to meet. Pick a place for a weekend. And that place would be obviously in the middle of nowhere somewhere, so that if people wanted to be introverted and all by themselves, they could go off and, I don't know, read a book under a tree, or if they wanted to go swimming, they could go swim, or If they wanted to go running, they could go run, or if they wanted to have discussions, they could have discussions. Basically have a couple, or have a dozen people or less in a place designed for 50. I'd love to be able to put something like that together, because I'd like to meet you guys in person. I'd really like to meet you guys in person. And yeah, real life interaction is very, very draining. Though I've noticed it tends to be less draining with the right group of people. So, perhaps in the distant future, it would be a possibility. It's actually weird to have the dynamic being such that I'm reading and talking. I've noticed personally that I get a lot more out of an interaction if I'm on the receiving end of hearing other people. That's why I bring up, say, Caleb. To some extent, impressed probably because we've talked for so much. Stephen and Yulga have also talked to another extent, because there's a lot more communicated, even for somebody that doesn't necessarily care too much about the body language and so on. There's an awful lot more communicated in the visual and in the auditory than the written word. And I can imagine what it's like for you to be thinking and saying these things, but there's no way that the words and the exact precise iterations of what it is you're trying to communicate can quite get communicated effectively through text less than 200 or 300 or whatever it is characters at a time. So it's really weird, kind of. So do I. Call this the consequence of many hundreds of hours of practice. The 200 character limit is terrible. The 200 character limit is like Twitter is 140 characters. It doesn't work. But if I may let you know what worked for me, or at least kind of helped. I mean, I'm still probably not coming across anywhere near as eloquently as someone, first off, who is extroverted, and second off, like let's say Michio Kaku or Neil deGrasse Tyson, or someone like that, right? Like Stephen Hawking, nobody cares how he talks because he has the mechanical voice, and people think it's cool. But if we go and look at, say, Neil deGrasse Tyson or Michio Kaku, they communicate very intuitively, but they're able to go and spin that intuition into words. From the MBTI framework, it's NE. So I'm stuck trying to figure out how to utilize TE for the same thing, and it doesn't come across as nearly as fluidly or fluently. And then I wind up having to think a lot before speaking, as opposed to speaking as a stream of consciousness, which is something I've discovered Caleb can do quite easily. He just speaks as a stream of consciousness because he's already thought everything beforehand. I'm thinking as words are coming out of my mouth, and sometimes I wind up getting overloaded. But yeah, I wound up giving way too big of a context for the little point that I'm trying to make, is that practicing oration reading things and finding turns of phrases that I like. Having a few stories in my head to default to, or a few themes that I can easily articulate, has been helpful for me. So, I've either done a lot of thinking, I either forced myself to do a lot of thinking and practicing beforehand. I'll read a piece and gather my thoughts about it. It is almost entirely due to practice, Jacob. It is almost entirely due to practice. Practice has helped some. But when I was a teenager, in my early teens especially, I was horrible. I was able to have one-on-one conversations with people, barely. But there were great, very vast periods of silence where I was searching for just one word. And that had to do with the fact that there are so many shades of nuanced expression that picking exactly the right word to say what I meant, being precise with my language, required way too much effort. Though I will say it gets easier the more you do it. Yeah, maybe. And maybe my standards for socially awkward are quite different from the norm, I know that. And that's mostly because, I'm open to interacting with anyone that's open to interacting with me. And I figure on giving everybody the benefit of the doubt. And whether this helps explain anything or not, at least this helps I think it helps contextualize a bit of my understanding of interpersonal interaction. And this is how I teach my kids this. And I know my son's he's going to be way better at interpersonal interaction than pretty much anyone in my immediate family, naturally. Now, of course, my daughter's going to have the advantage of being a woman and therefore being much more alluring, but my son naturally will be a good communicator. I'm pretty sure that my daughter's going to have to work on it a little more. And this is the eighth commandment. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. So what is false testimony? Or you ask the question, like in the catechism, what does this mean? As we should fear and love God so that we do not tell lies about our neighbor, betray him, slander him, or hurt his reputation. So that's part one. and I'll admit that I'm not perfect at this. I'm nowhere near perfect. I try not to lie about people. I don't want to betray anybody. I don't want to slander people, but I probably do wind up slandering people, and I'm guessing I probably do wind up hurting people's reputation. My goal might not be to hurt people's reputation, but I don't know necessarily how to represent things that are considerably less than positive, so I'm still figuring this one out. But the positive aspect of it is like, okay, you don't give false testimony against your neighbor. So what should one do? Defend him, speak well of him, and I think that this kind of puts it into perspective. Explain everything in the kindest way. So, well, what is the kindest way? Well, maybe imputing things to noble motives, I suppose, could be one. Or even imputing things to stupidity as opposed to malice. Imputing things to ignorance as opposed to malice. But explaining everything in the kindest way, or as the older versions, is putting the positive construction on things. If I'm constantly, at least in my own mind, explaining things in the kindest way, I'm not going to go and necessarily interact with somebody who is socially awkward in the same way that somebody else might, that they're like, I just want stimulus, give me stimulus. It's like, okay, I'll sit back I'll listen. I think everybody deserves a chance. At least if there's mutual goodwill, I'll talk with anyone, no matter how awkward it may seem, and I'm not going to think that it's awkward. I know enough people have given me the benefit of the doubt to give me enough of a chance to be able to communicate at all. You know, people have gone and put the best construction on my words. People have known that when I go and I'm here searching for a word to say precisely what I mean, it's not because I'm trying to disrespect their time, and if I say things in a more harsh way than what could conceivably be said by somebody who's focused mostly on preserving somebody else's feelings, that people at least would give me the benefit of the doubt and assume that I wouldn't be saying it unless I cared. And so that's the kind of a thing that I try to provide for other people. I'll assume that you wouldn't open your mouth about something unless you actually cared. So, however awkward it may feel, at least know that you have an accepting listener. And I think that an awful lot of these things are actually done best in person, even though it may feel more awkward at the onset, because there are still many personal context clues that text leaves out, even for someone who is autistic and doesn't, for instance, pick up on social cues, which we all do pick up on social cues. It just winds up being more a question of how much of it and then how conscious we are of it. Like, we all have the same eyes. Our brain architecture might be slightly different, but we all do have the same general senses. And this is actually the part where I don't particularly know how best to conclude a stream. I mean, I could just flat out say, caffeine is a laxative, but that would be socially inappropriate. Like, if I go and I say caffeine is a laxative, and I've consumed, I'll finish up my coffee. A great deal of it. Well, yeah. Well, I began at about quarter after. So that means we technically do have 7 more minutes. But I feel kind of awkward, especially having it, I think, just be the two of us now. And being the only one that has something to say, and just feeling like I'm pulling stuff out of my butt. I feel like I'm dominating a conversation wherein I would actually like to hear your opinion a lot more. But I suppose there always is the opportunity to send me Quora messages. And for those of you watching the video, if you're interested in sending me a message and hitting me up saying hi, talking about things, saying, oh, you're an idiot, or oh, we like what you're saying, whatever it may be, you're more than welcome to do so. I read all of them, and if they necessitate a response, I try to get to them, but sometimes I wind up being very much searching for words myself, and I take a long time to get to them. But on that note, I will say that the laxative effects of coffee are really getting to me, and oh yeah, that would be wonderful. That'd be wonderful. I can send you on Quora my Discord contact info if you don't already have it. Anyhow, yeah, on that note, see you later.